On the ninth morning, Eliza Rowe opened the south shutter of Frostbench House and saw that the town below her had disappeared. Not burned, not abandoned, just gone. Where Lantern Street had twisted between the assay office, the boarding house, and the little false front bank, there was only one hard, shining sheet of white. 9 feet of storm-packed snow had leveled the valley so completely that Silver Kettle looked less like a mining town than a thought the mountains had changed their mind about. Eliza held one hand against the stone beside the window. It was warm, not fire warm, not the quick heat of something that could fail if the wood ran out. It was the deep, stored warmth of rock that had been drinking sun for years, and giving it back slowly. Behind her, Jonah Rowe sat at the table with his ledger open and his pencil motionless between 2 fingers. He had stopped counting the food on day 7, not because the numbers no longer mattered, because the numbers had started including people who were not yet inside the house. They called it a burrow, he said. Eliza did not turn from the window. Below her, somewhere under that white surface, were doors that no longer opened, chimneys packed solid, roofs carrying more weight than any sane builder would have asked them to carry. They called it worse than that, she said. Then she lifted the first rope coil from its hook, tested the knot with both hands, and laid it beside the shovel. We are about to find out who is right. But that morning did not begin with the storm. It began 5 years earlier, when a 41-year-old widow from Vermont walked into a land office in a silver camp, pointed at a bare shelf of mountain rock, and asked what it cost to buy the part nobody wanted. Eliza Rowe had been raised in a granite yard outside Barre, Vermont, in a house where dust got into the seams of every coat and men judged one another by the straightness of a cut. Her father, Patrick Vale, was not an educated man in the formal sense. He owned 3 books, read 2 of them badly, and believed that a person who could not read stone was at a disadvantage in the world, whether they knew it or not. He taught Eliza by making her wait. A child wants the hammer. Patrick made her watch the seam. A child wants the crack. Patrick made her listen for the sound before the crack. He would set a chisel against granite and say, "The stone already knows where it will open. Your job is not to bully it. Your job is to notice." By 12, Eliza could hear the difference between a block that would split clean and a block that would betray you with a hidden flaw. By 26, she was cutting foundation stone for buildings whose owners never knew her name. By 33, after her first husband died in a quarry slide, she had learned the lesson that stone teaches slowly, and people usually learn too late. Weight never disappears. It waits, it transfers, and if you ignore where it wants to go, it will choose its own hour to answer you. Jonah Rowe entered her life as a man who respected measurements. That was rarer than romance, and more useful. He had been a canal surveyor in New York before a fever bent one leg badly enough to end field work. He could still walk, but not for miles of wet bank and broken grade. So he took bookkeeping contracts, taught arithmetic when he needed money, and spent his evenings drawing bridges that no one had asked him to design. They married late enough in life that neither of them mistook affection for rescue. He had numbers, she had stone. Between them, they shared a suspicion of anything built only to impress the eye. In 1882, Jonah brought home a railroad pamphlet describing settlements in the Mountain West where silver money was moving faster than common sense. Camps rising in valleys. Timber buildings thrown together in weeks. Hotels taller than the weather deserved. banks with painted fronts and no stone under them. Eliza read the paragraph twice. Then she looked at the little diagram of a canyon town wedged between two steep walls. "They're building on the floor," she said. Jonah nodded. "Where else would they build?" Eliza tapped the page with one calloused finger. "That is the question." Silver Kettle, Montana Territory, was loud enough to be heard before it was properly seen. In the spring of 1883, its valley rang with sledges, wagon wheels, saw blades, mule chains, and men who believed silver would keep coming because it had come yesterday. The town sat in a narrow bowl, hardly 400 yards across at its widest point. A creek cut through the middle. Lantern Street ran along the creek because that was where wagons could move, and because humans have a habit of mistaking convenience for safety. Above it all rose two walls of tawny volcanic tuff and gray shale, stepped and folded by time, with benches and shelves catching light at different hours of the day. Most people saw the rock as scenery. Eliza saw roof, wall, drain, hearth, and warning. On the south wall, nearly 25 feet above the valley floor, a shelf jutted from the cliff like a half-finished thought. Above it, the rock rolled forward into a natural brow that threw weather outward. Behind it, the tuff was dense enough to carve and soft enough to shape without destroying tools. A narrow goat trail led to it from the west end of town. Eliza stood below that shelf for almost an hour, while Jonah waited beside her with the patience of a man who knew when a calculation was being made without paper. At the land office, a young registrar named Owen Pike watched her mark the shelf on his survey map. "That bench?" he asked. "Yes." "There's no vein marked there." "I am not buying a vein." He squinted at the map, then at Eliza. "You want it for a claim cabin? For a house?" The room went quiet in the special way a room goes quiet when a person has said something everyone understands, and no one can fit into the usual box. Owen looked past her shoulder toward the cliff. "Ma'am, that is not a lot. That's a ledge. It faces south," Eliza said. "It has overhead protection. It has a seep line in the back wall. And your town is sitting in a wind trough." Owen blinked. The filing fee was $6. He accepted it slowly, as if the coin might be evidence in a future proceeding. When Eliza folded the receipt and placed it inside her coat, she paused at the door. "Mr. Pike," she said, "when a hard winter comes, tell people to look up." By supper, every saloon in Silver Kettle had improved the story. By midnight, Eliza Rowe had become the woman who bought a bird perch. By the next morning, the shelf had a name: Fool's Balcony. Caleb Voss enjoyed the name more than most. Voss owned the bank, the ore scales, half the lots along Lantern Street, and enough private debt to be considered respectable. He was building the Northern Crown Hotel at the east end of town, 3 stories of plain pine, imported windows, a tin roof, a cupola, and a dining room with space for 60 men who would never all eat quietly at once. Projected cost $11,000. He told people the number, because the number was part of the building. When he heard that Eliza Rowe had purchased a strip of cliff for $6 and meant to hollow a home into it, he sent his clerk with an offer of $60, a tenfold profit for doing nothing. Eliza declined before the clerk finished explaining. No counteroffer, no apology, just no. Voss did not care about the ledge. He cared about the refusal. Men like Caleb Voss were accustomed to opposition that named a price. Eliza's refusal named a value. That made it irritating. At the hotel frame raising 3 weeks later, Voss lifted a glass and looked toward the south wall, where Eliza and Jonah were unloading tool chests from a mule. "Give them 1 January, he said. They will be back on Lantern Street begging for stove heat. The men laughed because the hotel frame was rising behind him, and laughter often follows whatever looks tallest. Frostbench House took 16 months to build. Eliza did not build quickly because quick buildings had already won the valley floor. She began with the cut. Not a room, a cut. The first stroke of a chisel decides more than most people understand. It tells the wall whether you intend to work with it or against it. Eliza set the first cut along the natural seam at the back of the shelf and opened a shallow groove from east to west, no wider than her thumb. Then she deepened it. Then she worked downward. Day after day, the wall gave up powder, flakes, and blocks. Jonah hauled them out in baskets and stacked the usable pieces along the outer edge, where they became parapet, hearth stone, step face, and retaining wall. Their mule, Penny, learned the trail by July and stopped resenting it by September. The main room was carved 9 feet into the cliff and 12 feet across, with a south-facing window set deep enough that winter sun could enter and summer heat would not overwhelm it. Eliza angled the stone floor by less than a finger's width across the whole room, just enough to draw meltwater toward a gutter cut along the west side. The seep in the back wall became a basin. The basin became a channel. The channel became the difference between shelter and a warm prison. Jonah wrote all of it down, not prettily, accurately. "Why so much wall on the north side?" he asked one evening as Eliza checked the depth of a cut by lantern. "Because north is where winter thinks it owns the place." That is not an engineering term. It should be. He wrote it down anyway. The sleeping alcove came second, set deeper and lower than the main chamber so body heat would remain close. The storage pocket came third, tucked behind a dogleg turn where the temperature barely moved across a day. Then came the stable cut, just big enough for Penny, hay, and a feed bin kept off the stone floor by cedar blocks. She built no grand porch, no cupola, no ornamental front. Only a stone lip, a weather brow, a window, a door set back from drifting snow, and 6 iron rings driven deep into the bench along the outer wall. Jonah noticed the rings in October 1884. "What are those for?" "Ropes, I can see that." "Then you know as much as you need." He studied her face and decided not to argue with a woman who had already answered the larger question in her own mind. Total cost, including the claim fee, $312. The Northern Crown Hotel opened the same autumn with music, whiskey, a painted sign, and a lantern hung in the cupola, so travelers could see the building before they saw the town. Eliza watched the celebration from Frostbench House. The hotel glittered below. Her stone walls held the day's heat. Jonah stood beside her at the south window. "They built a lantern," he said. Eliza touched the stone frame. "We built a stove that does not need feeding." The first winter proved little. Snow came, but not enough. Cold came, but not with teeth. The Northern Crown was drafty, but tolerable. Frostbench used less than half its wood pile and never froze the water basin. Voss called it luck. Eliza called it an untested result. "The mountain has not asked the real question yet," she told Jonah. So the next summer, she stocked more than comfort required. Flour in sealed tins, beans in stone crocks, coffee, salt, lamp oil, hard cheese in wax cloth, dried apples, smoked ham, extra blankets, 3 shovels, 2 ice bars, spare rope, and enough lamp wicks to make Jonah raise an eyebrow. "We are feeding a boarding house now." "No," Eliza said. "We're allowing for mistakes." "Whose?" "Everyone's." In late November 1887, old Mercer Holt came down from his trapline earlier than anyone had seen him come in 20 years. Mercer had a beard like weathered rope and knees that predicted snow better than most instruments. He stood outside the mercantile, looking up at the western ridge, and said the elk had left the upper slopes too soon. The pine squirrels were packing cones, as if the forest had given them bad news. The creek ice had formed thick at the edges before the center had slowed. "Winter's coming crooked," he said. Caleb Voss overheard him and smiled without warmth. "Mercer has predicted the end of town every year since there was a town." Men laughed. Eliza did not. She bought 2 more sacks of flour, a coil of heavier rope, and all the canvas the mercantile had in stock. That night she checked every iron ring, every knot, every shutter, every storage tin, every point where water might freeze or smoke might reverse. Jonah watched her work in silence. At last he said, "You think it will be this year?" Eliza pulled the rope tight through her hands. "I think the mountain has been waiting to speak in a language people respect." The storm began on February 3rd, 1888, with wind and no snow. That was the first bad sign. Snowstorms usually announce themselves with sky and fall. This one sent the wind ahead like a warning it expected to be ignored. Before dawn, the valley began to hum. Loose signs snapped. Window glass trembled. Smoke from Lantern Street chimneys twisted sideways, struck the cliff wall, folded back, and crawled down the valley instead of rising out of it. Eliza watched the smoke and understood the shape of the problem. The valley was not merely receiving the storm, it was holding it. By sunrise, the first snow arrived. Fine, dry, fast. By noon, the street was gone under a foot. By nightfall, drifts had sealed half the doors along the north side of Lantern Street and had begun loading the roofs from one direction, pressing not downward evenly, but sideways and downward at once. That was what timber did not forgive. Wrong direction. Sustained pressure. Repeated hour after repeated hour until a wall stopped being a wall and became a postponed collapse. Frost Bench House did not collect snow at the door. The natural brow threw it outward. The stone lip broke the drift. The entrance remained clear except for a low ridge Eliza swept away twice a day with a corn broom. Inside, the walls did what they had been built to do. They slowed the world down. Day 2. The hotel stopped glowing from the lower windows. Day 3. Smoke from the Crown's main chimney vanished, then appeared in thin, wrong places along the second-floor siding. Jonah saw it and went pale. "Blocked flue?" Eliza nodded. "They will move upstairs. And then the roof decides." He looked at the rope rings. "We go down." "No," he turned to her sharply. "There are people in there. There are people in every building. If we go down now, we become 2 more. The wind hit the shutter hard enough to rattle the iron latch. Eliza waited until the sound passed. We help when help can reach them, not when guilt tells us to die inside of them. Jonah looked through the window at the buried valley, and the anger went out of him, because truth has a way of removing places for anger to stand. So they waited. Waiting was not rest. Eliza portioned food into parcels. Jonah turned the ledger into a survival chart. They moved blankets from the sleeping alcove into the main room. They cleared a place in the storage pocket that could become a sick bay. They heated stones near the hearth and wrapped them in cloth for hands and feet that might come in half-frozen. On day 5, Lantern Street lost its last visible edges. On day 6, the little church steeple snapped under a drift load and vanished so quietly in the storm that they saw it only because the shape was suddenly gone. On day 7, shortly before midnight, The northern crown answered the mountain. The sound rolled through the valley and came up through Frostbench House as a shiver in the floor. Not a crash like a tree. Bigger, layered. A first break, then a second, then the heavy percussion of one floor taking the next with it. Jonah reached the window before Eliza did. There was almost nothing to see through the snow. Only a hole in the pattern of dim light where the hotel had been. "The crown," he whispered. Eliza pressed one hand against the window frame. She had known it could happen. Knowing did not make the sound smaller. "North wall first," she said. "Then the upper rooms." "Can anyone live through that?" "Yes." The word came fast because delay would have made it a lie. Not everyone. But yes. Day 8 brought less snow and colder air. The storm was spending its strength. That should have been mercy. Instead, the temperature fell so hard that the valley snow changed character. Loose layers tightened. Wet layers locked. Wind-packed drifts hardened into a surface that could hold a man like frozen earth. At dawn on day 9, Eliza stepped beyond the stone lip and tested the crust. Her boot did not sink. The thermometer read 12 below, too cold. By afternoon, it had risen to 6 below, still dangerous. Then, at 3:10, a thread of smoke from the west end of town, thin, trembled, and stopped. Eliza watched it for a full minute. No return, no flicker, no sign of fresh fuel. She went to the hook where the rope hung. Jonah closed the ledger. Now. The descent took less than a minute and felt much longer. Eliza went first. One rope looped around her waist, the shovel strapped against her back, boots finding the holds she had memorized in summers, when no one understood why she studied a cliff instead of the street. Jonah followed, careful with his bad leg, steady enough because fear had no time to make him clumsy. The snow surface held them. It stretched across the valley like a false floor laid over a buried town. Eliza scanned for smoke, vapor, roof hints, memory. Memory mattered most. She knew where the mercantile had stood relative to the creek bend. She knew which houses had hearths on their south walls. She knew where the boarding house roof would have failed, and where a pocket of air might remain. She chose the first place, by almost nothing, a thumb-wide stain of gray against white. They dug for 3 hours. Not heroically. Heroic digging gets sloppy and kills people in a collapsed cut. They dug with rhythm. Jonah cleared the upper spoil. Eliza cut a shaft down the side of what had been the Mason family cabin, bracing the packed snow with planks they scavenged from the roof edge. At 7 feet, her shovel struck shutter. She knocked 3 times. From inside came a sound so small she almost mistook it for the building settling. Then a child's voice. Alive. The first survivors came out, blinking like people returned from underground. Harriet Mason, her husband Abel, his mother, and 4 children wrapped in quilts and smoke. The baby did not cry until cold light hit his face, and then everyone on the snow surface felt the sound as permission to breathe. Eliza handed Abel a shovel. He looked at it, then at the white valley. "Where?" "The boarding house," she said. "South wall. Listen before you dig." He nodded once. The rescued became the rescuers. By nightfall, there were 17 people in Frostbench House. By the next night, 34. By the 4th day after the storm, there were 61 people inside, and around a house built for 2, and the house did not complain. Stone does not admire you. It does not pity you. It does not resent the load. It simply holds, if you have asked it the right question. The hardest excavation was the northern crown. No smoke marked it, no sound came from it. No visible corner proved where it had fallen. But Eliza knew buildings by failure. The hotel had collapsed north to south. The kitchen had been on the southwest corner. Kitchens had hearths. Hearths meant masonry. Masonry meant a void might remain where timber had fallen around it instead of through it. She marked the place with the shovel point. Caleb Voss's clerk, who had been rescued from the bank the day before, stared at the blank snow. "Mrs. Rowe, the hotel was 20 yards east of here." "The cupola was," Eliza said. "The kitchen is under us." No one argued after that. They dug all day. At hour 6, 2 men had to be hauled out because their hands stopped working. At hour 8, Eliza cut through a pocket of snow and struck cloth. Not wood. Cloth. A wool coat, frozen stiff at the edge. Beneath it was Caleb Voss, curled forward in the angle between a brick hearth and a fallen beam. His arms were spread wide, making a wall of his own body between the cold void and the 3 people behind him. His wife, Ruth, his daughter, Anna, and a kitchen boy named Peter who had crawled there when the north wall broke. Voss looked up when daylight reached him. His cheeks were dark with frostbite. His mouth had cracked. His eyes found Eliza and held there, not with gratitude at first, but with the stunned recognition of a man whose error had acquired shape, weight, and a human cost. Eliza reached down. He took her hand. She pulled him into the light. He tried to stand, failed, and almost apologized. "Do not waste air," Eliza said. "We need you carried, not dignified." A sound moved through him that might have been a laugh if his body had not been so near the end of itself. At the cliff base, before the rope climb, Voss looked up at Frostbench House. From below it did not look grand. A window, a dark mouth in the stone, a line of rope, a dozen faces above it waiting to help. "I offered you $60, he said, voice broken by smoke. Eliza tightened the rope around his chest. "You did. For that." "For this," she corrected. Then she signaled the pull team above. Frostbench held 68 people for 10 days. That number mattered because every person changed the arithmetic. Jonah posted rations on the inside wall by the south window each morning. Flour, beans, water. Coffee for the watch shifts only. Children first when hot food was scarce. Sickest nearest the inner wall. Dry socks rotated by need, not by standing. Fairness became as important as food. People can endure hunger longer when they believe the measure is honest. Dr. Miriam Chase, who had been found in the back room of the Mercantile, with her medical bag tied to her waist, turned the storage pocket into an infirmary, and frostbite, smoke lungs. Afterward, crushed fingers, 1 broken collarbone. 2 cases of fever that might have become fatal in any colder room. The stone walls gave her one advantage the valley had denied everyone else. Stable temperature. That, and clean water from the seep, saved more lives than anyone toasted later, because people preferred dramatic rescues to quiet infrastructure. Caleb Voss survived. His fingers survived. The Northern Crown did not. For the first 3 days inside Frostbench, he said almost nothing. He sat with his children against the warm stone and watched people move through a system that had no need for his money and no room for his old confidence. On the 4th day, he asked Jonah what work needed doing. Jonah handed him a slate and told him to calculate blanket rotations. Voss looked at the slate as if it were a punishment. Then he did the work. Badly at first. Then better. On the 6th day, Eliza found him outside, helping dig a second melt channel away from the entrance. His hands were bandaged, his coat was borrowed, his face was still marked by frost, the trench crooked to the left. She looked at it. "It will drain," she said. He waited because by then he understood that Eliza's silences often contained another sentence. It will also freeze where you have made it shallow. Deepen the turn. He nodded. No defense, no performance, just the beginning of a tension. When the snow settled enough for the town to stand in its own ruins, Silver Kettle looked smaller than anyone remembered. The storm had not destroyed everything equally. That was the lesson. Low stone buildings survived. Timber buildings with steep exposed faces failed. Tall facades failed worst. Chimneys that faced the northwest packed solid. Doors on the windward side became useless within hours. The Creek Street, so convenient in summer, had served as a trough for the storm to load and reload. Of 31 buildings, 20 were beyond repair. 7 could be salvaged. 4 had held well enough to teach from. The dead numbered 23, 19 during the storm, 4 before the rescue crews reached them. There are numbers a town reads differently after it has carried bodies. On April 12, 1888, the survivors gathered at the base of the south wall because no building large enough remained. Frostbench House looked down on them without looking like it meant to. Eliza stood at the edge of the crowd until Mercer Holt called out, "Mrs. Rowe, we'd rather not guess wrong twice." So she stepped forward. She did not give a speech. She gave a plan. No more tall fronts along Lantern Street. No doors facing northwest unless there is a protected entry. No chimney without a cap and side shield. No sleeping rooms under unsupported upper floors. No roof built for pride instead of load. Any family willing to work can cut into the south shelves. The north wall will serve for storage, a hall, and summer rooms. The valley floor is for wagons, mills, and what can be lost without killing a family. A man near the creek raised his hand. "You want us all living in holes?" Eliza looked at the slope above them. "I want you living where winter has to spend itself before it reaches your children." The answer ended the laughter more completely than anger could have. Then Anna Voss, 12 years old and still wearing a bandage across one cheek, said, "Will you teach us how to cut the rock?" Eliza turned toward her. The crowd turned, too. That was the moment Silver Kettle changed. Not when the hotel fell. Not when the first survivor came out of the snow. When a child asked for the knowledge instead of the miracle. "Yes," Eliza said, "but I will not teach anyone to hurry." The rebuilding took 4 years. Which was how everyone knew it was different from the first building of Silver Kettle. Fast towns look finished before they are safe. The new town looked unfinished for a long time. Scaffolds on the south wall, cut marks in the tuff, rope lines, stone stairs, children carrying water, bankers carrying spoil baskets. Men who once bragged about frontage learning to ask whether a roof had somewhere to send weight. Jonah's notes became lessons. Eliza's corrections became rules. Mercer Holt's weather memory became part of the planning instead of background amusement. Dr. Chase claimed the first finished chamber in the north wall as a permanent infirmary because, as she put it, "If the town insists on nearly dying every few years, I prefer to work somewhere sensible." Caleb Voss funded the community hall and cut stone on it 3 mornings a week. He was not good at first. People enjoyed that too much, and then less so when he kept coming. His daughter Anna was better. By 16, she could read a seam faster than most grown men. By 20, she was teaching new arrivals why the old Lantern Street had been a lesson and not a tragedy to be repeated for sentiment's sake. In 1893, Jonah printed a booklet in Helena at his own expense, 72 pages. The Frostbench Method. Building for snow, wind, and stone in high valleys. He put Eliza's name before his on the cover and refused to discuss it as generosity. It is not generosity to label the source correctly, he told the printer. Copies went to Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, and mining camps no map had yet forgiven. Some people ignored it. Some laughed. But in places where winter had already humbled expensive timber, the booklet traveled faster than advertisements. Men came to Silver Kettle to see the shelf house. They expected a monument. They found Eliza in an apron, correcting a boy's chisel angle before he ruined a seam. They expected a story about a storm. She gave them a lesson about load paths. They expected bravery. She talked about drainage. That disappointed some of them. It saved others. Years passed the way stone measures time, not by drama, but by what remains after weather has had repeated chances. Silver Kettle changed its shape. The valley floor stayed open enough for flood and snow to move. Homes climbed the walls. Steps replaced trails. Chimneys wore shields. Storage rooms were cut into the north face where summer stayed cool and winter could not get its teeth deep. The old town became a story people told children when they complained about carrying small stones up long stairs. Caleb Voss died in 1901 in a 3-room stone house on the south wall, smaller than the hotel kitchen he once lost. The crooked melt channel he cut at Frostbench was never corrected all the way. Eliza left one slight bend in it, and when asked why, she said, "A useful mistake should remain visible." Jonah died in 1909 with a pencil in his hand and a page of measurements beside him. Eliza lived 7 years after him. She slowed, but not in the ways people expected. Her walking shortened. Her hearing faded in one ear. Her hands grew stiff enough that fine lettering became difficult. But she could still lay her palm against a wall and tell a student whether the stone was lying. The inscription above the Frostbench door was carved in the summer after Jonah died. Not by Jonah, by Eliza. 3 lines, shallow enough to hold shadow, deep enough to outlast paint, fashion, debt, and most versions of certainty. It read, "Wait remembers, weather collects, build where truth can hold." On a cold morning in February 1916, Eliza Rowe sat beside the south window of Frostbench House and watched sunlight cross the stone floor she had cut 32 years earlier. The water basin moved quietly in the back wall. The valley below was white, but not erased. Smoke rose from shielded chimneys on both cliffs. Children crossed the high steps with satchels. A team hauled timber along the open floor where no one slept anymore. Silver Kettle had not defeated winter. That was not the point. It had stopped flattering itself that winter was something to defeat. Eliza placed her hand against the stone beside the window, warm, patient, unimpressed, and honest. The mountain had spoken once in a language no one could ignore. After that, the town learned to answer in stone.